Stephanie is an economist from MIT, and she started this company called the Prism Group, and she's going to talk about blockchain and economics. Let's welcome her.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, as you can tell, I'm not Nils. I hope the Facebook emergency is okay. So I'm going to be talking about blockchain and economics today from an extremely applied perspective, and in a second you'll see why. So as Avi said, I'm a founding economist of a company called Prism Group. We came together about 2 years ago as blockchain entered the mainstream because we're PhD economists. I did my PhD in an area called market design at Harvard, and we realized there was going to be an opportunity for a lot of really interesting economic design. And so we wanted to come together and form a group that worked with blockchain projects to think about the design of the different components that touched on a lot of economics that we knew. And so we do a combination of advising, research, consulting, really sort of translational stuff. Hopefully this will be the last sort of salesy thing you see today. And so what excited us, and the reason we left academia, left our previous jobs and decided to start Prism Group, is because blockchain projects are rethinking how economies are designed, right? And I know that there's a wide variety of familiarity with economics in the audience, so this is a more broad level talk. But blockchain projects, especially permissionless ones on a daily basis, are thinking about how can we use currency, how can we design incentives, how can we design marketplaces in new and interesting and more decentralized ways. And there's lots of really great opportunities to apply tools from economics to try to make these systems work. In more traditional settings, it's typically quite difficult to have an opportunity to redesign a whole market. You typically have to convince a whole lot of people if you want to redesign a multi-million-dollar spectrum auction or a school matching mechanism, which I'll talk about later. Takes a lot of years. You've usually got to be quite advanced, and you only get one shot. So the chance to see so many iterations on how economic systems could be designed and redesigned was an opportunity that was too good to pass up. And there are a lot of different definitions of what is economics. Obviously, there's micro and macro and subfields of both. So what we think about is we come at this from a more microeconomic point of view, which is that economics is thinking about how individuals make decisions, right? If you go and take a first economics class, you talk about rational decision making under constraints. You take another one, you talk about behavioral issues. But the idea is that there's systematic patterns in how people make decisions. People can be strategic. How are they going to interact with the platform that you're building? How are they going to choose to use the tools you're making? And once they make those decisions, are you going to be happy with the outcome as the platform founder, right? So one of the most, again, interesting parts of working on economic design and blockchain is getting to bring together different aspects of economics. And so this is what we lovingly call our house, right? So when we first started thinking deeply about design, we were like, okay, well, my business partner did her PhD in contract design. I did mine in market design, information systems, and there's whole Nobel Prizes on the role of information in markets. How do we bring this together into a unified framework? So we think about this in terms of layers, right? So obviously, if you're a business and you're building something on blockchain, we hope you've got some kind of value proposition. You've raised some capital. A year ago, this was, you had an ICO, maybe not so much anymore. And then you start to build the different layers of incentives and mechanisms that shape incentives. So thinking about, how do we design a contract interaction between two people? You're buying and selling something. What does the contract look like? Is there dispute resolution? Do you have an escrow system set up? Stepping back, what does the marketplace look like? Do you have search and matching? How is your pricing? Do you actually need an auction if you're going to have one on your platform? What information mechanisms does the platform need to provide? And then how does the token and the governance interact with that? Right? So, as we've learned, just inventing a token out of thin air is sometimes a bad idea. A token, if there's a native token, it needs to have a purpose. It should interact with the economics of the rest of the system. And governance, as I'll talk about a little bit later, is how, thinking about how a decentralized system can evolve over time. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about a field called what we call economic design. Comes mostly from an area of economics called market design that many of you may be familiar with. But I wanted to start out just by reflecting on the progress that's been made in thinking about economic design and blockchain over the past year, right? So as I was putting this together, I came across a presentation I did about a year ago talking about sort of what do we think are the biggest issues in economic design applied to blockchain and blockchain projects. And the four that we saw a year ago were the following. So the first was the idea that tokens are incentives, right? We have a complex incentive design problem. We're going to create a native token. It's going to solve our problem, and we're sort of done. The second fallacy was the idea that economics was not useful for blockchain. And we saw this especially for projects that had started sort of before the boom. This was not relevant. There was a sort of a quest for a universal mechanism. And then fourth, and this relates to the talk that Primavera gave earlier today, was the idea of governance. And do we need governance, and how much governance do we need? So do any of you remember token curated registries?
No.
So these were, again, something that we saw more of probably at the end of 2018. But a token curated registry was basically a way of coming up with a decentralized mechanism for curating a list. And the idea was that we didn't want the New York Times to have power to decide the best restaurants in New York, or Jonathan Gold to have power to decide the best restaurants in Los Angeles. We're going to set up a decentralized mechanism facilitated by a token that's going to do this curation for us. And I won't go through all the steps, but this is my stylized diagram of how token curated registries work. And the basic idea was that there was this very complex and interesting multi-party market incentive design problem that's hard. And the TCRA was basically just to say, like, here's a native token, and everyone's going to have to use it, and this will automatically align the incentives of the system. These typically didn't work out very well. They sort of gone away. But this general idea that you can just use tokens to align incentives is something that we've really seen dissipate over the past 12 months. The second piece is, this is what I like to call the blockchain rebel. This is one of my favorite guys. So he loves Bitcoin, and he's in a desert, and there's this idea that other areas of expertise were not applicable to blockchain-based projects. This is also something that we've really seen evolution on, and sort of an interaction with other areas. Another thing that I've seen sort of move on in the past 12 months is what I used to call the borrowed suit. So in a conversation with a blockchain project, you say, okay, you really need economic design, and the response would be, okay, who do we go copy it from? And for many, for those of you who do mechanism and market design, it's highly customized, it's highly specific to the environment. And if you just copy and paste, you end up looking like our friend here wearing his dad's suit, and something that doesn't really work well for your specific setting. And finally, something that we've seen less of lately is what I called forking is freedom. You could also call it governance, let's wing it. But this idea that formal governance or formal decision-making procedures for a collective were not necessary, right? And if people can't agree on what they want to do, we're just going to keep forking until everyone's on their own individual blockchain and, call it a day. So again, these are stylized, but, just reflecting now, these are really topics that you don't see as much of a discussion of anymore. So, first, we've seen a reckoning that there's no real free lunch in issuing tokens, right? If you issue a token and you sell it, the people who are still holding it are going to want it to have some value that comes from somewhere. And many times, in order to have a token that has value, you need to have created investment, right? You either need it to have expensive collateral that's attached to your stablecoin, or you need to have invested in the ecosystem that the token is facilitating so that people actually want to come and buy and use it. And these things are expensive. It's difficult to just mint a token and put it out into the world and have it be worth things. Second, we see proactive governance design as a part of platform design. So this is something that came up this morning. A lot of platforms are thinking about on-chain governance as just another part of their system design. The third is starting to see more insightful outside-in academic research. And what I call outside-in is, people using publicly available data, thinking about mining pools, which we just saw, thinking about transactions on Bitcoin and other publicly available blockchains. So using what we now have as a very nice time series combined with economic insights to help think about how these markets work. Just as one example, for those of you who were at, I called it CESC, but I guess it's CESC 2 weeks ago, San Francisco Blockchain Week. There's a conference put on by Blockchain at Berkeley, and there was an economics track that we put together. One of the presenters is actually from Haas, a professor named Christine Parler who studies finance. And she was looking at something called price discrimination in Bitcoin transaction processing. So her thesis was basically that miners were leaving blocks a little bit empty so that they could reject low-paying transactions and force people to pay more. And this is actually, a really big, this goes against sort of a lot of the prevailing literature and is a really, if true, is a very sort of interesting and fundamental shift in how we think about miner behavior. So I kind of sat there and was like, whoa, this is great. And then finally, of course, as we see from this room and lots of other venues, we see more interactions not only with game theorists and economists, but lawyers and psychologists and sociologists. And you see more and more of these interactions as well as with startups. So I want to actually spend the rest of the time talking about what you could call economic design, market design. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this, but I'm going to assume sort of a base of start from the beginning. So there's a set of economists who think about how do you study and design markets so that they work well. One of them is Al Roth, who's at Stanford. He was one of my PhD advisors. And his basic insight that he's really moved, he and a group of eminent economists have really started to think about how does an economist act like an engineer, right? You can't just bring your theoretical insights. The analogy that gets used a lot is the difference between physics and engineering when you're building a bridge, right? Physics is great, but when you're actually building the bridge, you have to think about the mud and the rocks and all the details of the particular landscape that you're building on and incorporate them into. So how do we think about a very similar kind of approach for economic design of a variety of environments? And this approach, I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the framework for it. It turns out there have been a number of large economic design instances that are going to win a lot of people, a lot of Nobel Prizes, that followed very similar sort of approaches to design. They were in very different environments, but they followed a similar technique. And they're really interesting. So one of them is the auction of broadband spectrum. This was in the late 90s. Is anyone familiar with the spectrum auctions? Avi is. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah, you've heard about them. So in the late 90s, I think it was the FCC realized that their method for allocating broadband spectrum was not working. They used to have it by petition. So sort of the first system was you could petition and say, this is why I need the spectrum. That was taking too long. And then they tried a lottery. The thing was anybody could enter the lottery. So one of the big blocks of spectrum in Boston went to a group of lawyers who just entered the lottery and were like, or not lawyers, dentists, who were like, hey, let's see if we can win some spectrum. And they got some spectrum, and so that was a terrible idea. So a group of economists from Caltech and from Stanford and from University of Western Ontario were brought in to think about how do we design this very complex combinatorial auction. And they started from scratch. They thought about other auctions. They thought about, what experiments can we run. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But they ended up designing an auction that's been used for, I think the aggregate total over all applications is like $100 billion worth of allocation problems. And this was an environment where there had not been an auction like this designed before, right? The economists were brought in, and they were like, okay, you're going to design this and launch it. You've got one shot. Tell us what to do. Another example where economic design has come up, this is Professor Roth's work with numerous people at Stanford, is the medical residency match. Anybody married to a med student, friends with med student? There we go. For those of you who aren't familiar with the US medical system, when you finish medical school in the US, your first job is called a residency. And you actually don't get it through a free labor market. You go through a centralized matching mechanism. So you go through a round of applications, you go through a round of interviews, and then everybody submits rank order lists. And an elaborate version of the Gale-Shapley algorithm is used to match people in jobs. So you're a doctor, you're coming up on your final year of med school, you get an envelope in the mail, you rip it open, it tells you where you're moving. And it needed to be redesigned again in the late 90s because it turns out that medical students were all getting married to each other, but you couldn't enter the match together. So there were a lot of really unhappy married couples, so they redesigned it so you could enter as a married pair. And this similar, actually a very similar algorithm with a lot of sort of engineering tweaks is applied to assign K-12 students to schools in New York and Boston. And after the success of the residency match, they asked the same team to come in and think about centralized mechanisms for assigning students to schools. Ended up using something very similar to Gale-Shapley with a lot of tweaks, again, because these are different environments. And so what is, yeah?
By what metric is the medical residency system a success? I mean, I'm not, it isn't, I don't.
It's a really good question, especially if you talk to recent doctors who have gone through it. They don't love it. People have looked at matches that unraveled, basically like you had a match and then you didn't. And fewer doctors got jobs. There were sort of more empty openings. And people who were really good ended up at lower matched institutions. So basically what you get is you go from having a national market to a whole bunch of little mini markets. And so there are efficiency gains from being able to have a national market. Without the match, you're basically looking for a job on the weekends, so you're kind of looking around your medical school. So it's basically being able to pull together a national network. That's not to say everybody loves it, but there is efficiency. Very similar with school matching. When the New York City schools called up the team that did this, the reason they were looking for a new mechanism is that a third of students every year were not matched to schools. So they go through the school matching process as it was, and you have a third of students where they're just like, no outcome for you. And so one of the benefits of the revised mechanism is that students get matched. And there's sort of metrics like that.
There's also psychological benefit in that you don't have to game the system. You kind of, if you play honestly and just rank yours.
That's
evidence that people play it, like schools play it dishonestly now, where they like make coercive statements demanding to be ranked first by the students.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, that's.
There is. It's interesting sort of how everybody learns loopholes in mechanisms. But one of the efforts, especially in Boston, was to make the matching mechanism strategy proof, especially for the families. They didn't want anybody to have to think about strategic ordering. But yeah, no, reading about New York City public schools always gives me the shivers. Okay. There we go. So just to recap, if you look at these different stories, these were done by different teams. They happen to be done at similar times, sort of in the late 90s and early 2000s. And they followed a very similar paradigm for thinking about how do you design a mechanism for thousands of people or millions of dollars that's going to get launched and has never been used before. And there's a very similar pattern that all of these projects followed. So the first is to draw upon economic and game theory, right? What do we know? What models can we use? Where can we start thinking about different categories of mechanisms and the different parameters we want to think about changing? Second is what observational evidence do we have, right? So what existing markets look like this? Where have we seen auctions that, is there something we could take from timber auctions to think about spectrum auctions? What can we put together based on observational pieces? The third piece is going into the lab. So the spectrum auction team actually this was very interesting. So once they had sort of families of models that they were thinking of implementing, they partnered with Charlie Plott, who is at Caltech, who's an experimental economist, and they just ran horse races. They said, okay, they had a well-defined sort of list of goals that they wanted to pursue, and they kept running experiments and seeing which auction mechanisms were getting them closest to what they wanted. One of the things that's one of my favorite things about this story is that Professor Plott is also an accomplished auction designer, and he actually ended up knocking out one of his own models, which is sort of, I think, is a very good testament to the scientific nature of the process. And then finally rolling this out, and sometimes you'll see smaller scale lab experiment or field experiments. So for example, for the Spectrum auction, after the lab experiments were done and they had their sort of main candidate design, they didn't just go and redesign a $10 billion market. They carved off a small segment of the market, which was the pager bandwidth. And they just ran like a little 2-day auction with a simplified version and said, okay, let's see if this works. It works fine. Okay, let's go out and make sure this happens. Yeah.
In a lab about options?
You design basically little mini toy experiments.
But like, who are the rational agents playing? Like, is it like grad students playing options, or is it?
It's typically, undergrads. So I think this case, this was actually interesting because they were doing it, and it was Caltech undergrads. So they would come in and, break the mechanism or find some super crazy way to game it.
Is it important to find something they care about, like try to apply it, I don't know, to the dormitory assignments, or like, because it's hard. I mean, if you really want somebody to think rationally, they usually need to find something they care viscerally about.
So that typically goes more in the lab section. You can actually get a good amount from, one thing you'll get a lot from lab experiments is finding out that the mechanism you've designed is too complicated, right? So you present it to the lab agents and they're just like, what on earth, what is this? Like, we don't know how to interact with it. It would take a lot of time and investment. But I agree, sort of, if you're thinking about getting things that are the right magnitude for people to care about it, you're thinking more about lab field experiments. So I agree with that. So to keep going, because this is, about blockchain, this is not about school matching, I think that, the reason I wanted to talk about this and sort of talk about this framework is that we've gotten to the point, from my point of view, in thinking about applied economic design and blockchain, that we've moved past sort of the first order things I talked about that you saw more a year ago, magical tokens and anarchy and freedom, unlimited and a complete lack of design. And we moved into a stage where there's really opportunities for taking this approach to economic design and thinking about it in a blockchain setting. And so this is what I want to talk about sort of for the rest of the talk. And this is, these are sort of categories of things that we see across projects that there's really more work to be done in digging in and thinking about the specifics of how to engineer systems so that they work well. And so the three are, first, the practical design of performance incentives, right? So I'll talk about in more detail what this is, but sort of, in many blockchain-based systems, you're thinking about how do you incentivize people to do what you need them to do, to contribute resources to the network, to participate in governance, and you're going to give them a reward in exchange for doing a specific behavior. Turns out that the design of incentives like that is tremendously difficult. And I'll talk about that more later. The second is the adoption of what I'll call market infrastructure, but thinking about the invisible levers of market design that make the markets we use every day function well, and thinking about how they could translate into a blockchain setting. And then the third, and this is again related to things we've seen today, is thinking about sort of how much governance do we need? And sort of there, I'll discuss a little further. We've moved a lot on sort of how much governance do we see in platforms, and now we're thinking about how do we design governance that's the right amount of participation but doesn't overwhelm the participants. All right, so first a little bit about performance incentives. Yeah.
What criteria do you mention to build up the governance?
So I would love your thoughts on this when I'm done. All lawyers, like, one thing is we think about governance from a very economist point of view, and I love having lawyers and law professors in the audience because you guys have a ton of context. So you'll see the economic version. I'd love to see that afterwards. So first, in terms of performance incentives, this is one of my favorite. This is the Wells Fargo account scandal. Do people remember this? So Wells Fargo was trying to figure out how do they increase revenue, and so they decided that what they were going to do was pay their employees based on the number of accounts that the employees opened, because they believed that if employees opened more accounts, they would have more revenue, and then it turns out what the employees did was they just opened a ton of fake accounts, right? So there was this implicit belief in the management, I don't know what was going on in their brains, but basically that there was this correlation between the number of accounts that were opened and the business that the bank did, and if they pulled on this one lever, they would get a positive response in the lever that they actually cared about, which was the amount of business. A lot of people are going to prison, I believe, over this. So, incentive design is also really important for decentralized systems. One thing that we think a lot about is the relationship between the incentive design for miners and the level of distribution of control, right? So if you think about what were some of the original objectives of Bitcoin mining, you wanted the protocol to be widely adopted, peer-to-peer, to be secure, and to have distributed control, right? And for 3 of these 4 criteria, there's actually been a great deal of success. But as we saw in the previous talk, there's probably more consolidation than he, she, or they would have preferred in the current design. And this is actually an incentive issue. This is thinking about, what are the incentives to invest and how do they shape the incentives for consolidation versus separation. And so I think one of the challenges we see is that, again, designing well-functioning performance incentives is extremely difficult. Figuring out how to compensate people and what to compensate them for so that they do the activity that you want them to do and not something random that's not actually what you want is quite challenging. But especially when you don't have centralized control, right? When you have a distributed system without somebody in charge, this is extremely important because this is how you're going to motivate people to contribute resources or participate in governance or whatever else you want. So these are some of the issues that can come up in designing performance incentives. I won't go through them in detail. But one of the challenges we do see is, especially as platforms grow and they get wider adoption, there's going to be interaction with strategic agents, right? So a question we get a lot is, many platforms start out with a highly committed set of almost altruistic actors, right? So they really love your platform and they're very excited about the product and maybe they're willing to mine even if it isn't profitable at the moment. And so to what extent can you count on that kind of participation versus thinking about profit maximizing actors, and how does this change as the platform grows? And this has actually been a challenge. So one platform that has had some public issues, and I am not meaning to rip on Storage. I think it's awesome that they have discussed this in public, and this is why we use this. So Storage launched their decentralized storage, as their name says, decentralized storage. And it turns out that there were some money pumps in their incentive design. So you could make money by being a person who stored files and had files stored, and you just passed files back and forth to each other, and you could make quite a bit of money. And then the question was, during this process, will people find these money pumps? And it turns out the answer is yes, right? So, understanding that there's going to be a set of individuals who are going to be profit maximizing and who will find the money pumps on your platform is something that I think is difficult in the design process.
So, the money pump essentially it's a wealth transfer, right? From the investors of the storage network to the miners? Or, there's no efficiency gain, so clearly, the money pump, where does the money come from? It's not like they're building more tractors because of storage and therefore having more resources to share.
Right, so it was, I think in that particular case, it was whoever had bought the token, right? I think they were actually getting money from the platform itself. So the platform was sort of paying subsidies, I think the platform intended this treasury to be used for productive activity, and this was not productive activity. And just a last piece is thinking about, as we design incentives, a lot of the times we focus on, I'm going to do this in the contract, and then you're going to pay me for it, and that's it. But there's actually different levers that you can use to design incentive systems. And so it's not just formal contracts or smart contracts, but something called a relational contract, which is basically that if I behave well with you, you will give me future business, right? And so this is something that we use quite often when our formal contracts are not really, there's not really a metric for what we want. So, for example, a lot of professional services firms actually survive on relational contracts. If you ever work in management consulting, it's all relational contracts. And then also thinking about the role of reputation and how well-designed reputation mechanisms can incentivize good behavior, because if you behave poorly, everybody's going to know about it. All right. The second piece I wanted to talk about is the introduction of market mechanisms and thinking about what are the market institutions. Yeah?
Do you have examples, like in that last slide, do you have examples of, so storage was an example of a failure, but is anybody doing any of these things well right now?
So I can give you a really great non-blockchain example. eBay does these fantastically. For those of you who know Steve Tadelis at Haas, he was involved in this. He's an amazing economist. So if you think about can I talk about eBay? Does that work for the example?
Oh, sure.
Okay. I'll go through it.
Sure I haven't used eBay, so
Okay.
tell me how it works.
Yeah, so fraction of people who have used eBay? Got it.
I have heard of it, I just haven't used it.
eBay is a great example. They have great market design, and you can see all of it. Let me see. Okay, so this is another piece of eBay. I have pictures from eBay. We're going ahead. Oh, I got rid of that one, sorry. So eBay is a peer-to-peer sales platform. So if I have an antique teacup and I want to sell it, I go on eBay and I say one antique teacup, Pasadena. And you go online, you're like, oh, there's the antique teacup I want. I'm in Boston. You can either use an auction mechanism or a buy it now mechanism to agree on a price. You have a certain amount, I have a certain amount of time to mail it to you. We pay via PayPal or whatever mechanism you want. So it's a peer-to-peer market with a huge variety of stuff on it, right? Heterogeneous goods, homogeneous goods, and there's a lot of, that's been written about it. And so the key here is that it is in eBay's best interest that the buyers and the sellers who show up to the platform behave in good faith, right? If you know that everybody on eBay is selling stuff that doesn't actually look like the picture, and I know that you're never going to send me anything, no one's going to use eBay, right? So they have a variety of incentive mechanisms to incentivize truthful participation. So, of course, there's a contract, right? Like, I will send you this, and I'll talk about dispute resolution, but there's dispute resolution which basically says, one of us has violated the explicit contract that we had to buy and sell something, eBay help. There's also relational contracting. So an example of this that comes up is thinking about the relationship between, so the platform actually mediates this. So another way, if you're a bad seller, that they'll punish you is they'll actually negatively weight you in the search algorithm. So the next time somebody comes and they're like, teacup, if I've been terrible, I get plummeted to the bottom, you'll never find me. And then the third one is they have a star rating system. So you sort of layer all of these together. Yeah?
Where do you draw the line between relational contracts and reputation? Because some of that sounded like reputation things.
So it's an interesting question. A traditional relational contract is just a bilateral relationship.
The search weighting is not that.
Right. So you could think about if you needed to buy, eBay is not a great example for relational contracts unless you just buy a teacup every week, right? You could think about if Avi's trying to build up his set of, do you collect something in particular? I'll just keep using teacups unless you have another preference. Scarves. If you wanted to, if I'm a great vendor of scarves and you want to buy a scarf every month, you might come back to me. There are models that think about.
Can you blacklist certain buyers?
You can, I think so. Yeah. And so there's interesting research thinking about sort of when do you go from relational contracts to reputation. It's sort of you get bigger and bigger networks. So the second piece, and we've touched on this, so I'll go quickly through, is thinking about market mechanisms. So again, coming from the ethos of forking is freedom, there can be a hesitancy to use market design mechanisms to help markets function well, but they can actually have a very useful purpose. So one of them is dispute resolution. So again, if I don't send Abi his teacup, he can go here and he can say, I haven't received my teacup, and eBay will intervene and make me send it, or make me give you a refund and kick me off the platform and do all sorts of good stuff. So this builds trust within the platform itself. There's a blockchain-based competitor to eBay called OpenBazaar. And they actually launched, and they specifically said, we're not going to have intermediation. We're just going to let you buy and sell. They had almost nothing. I think you even get to pick what search engine you use on OpenBazaar. And very, very quickly, they found they needed dispute resolution, because no one's going to use a peer-to-peer sales platform without it. So they have a market for dispute arbitrators now. Many of you are familiar with sort of thinking about the different mechanisms that can be used to match people in markets. I won't go into Netflix because it's not a two-sided market, it's a one-sided market, but thinking about how do you use choice data to give people what they want in a very crowded market with lots of goods. Another piece I think is really interesting. Again, this is Steve Tidelis at Haas with Chris Nosko redesigned the eBay reputation mechanism. So basically, if you look at the star rating on eBay for sellers, it turns out the distribution of it looks like this. So it's from 0 to 1. This is 0.96, and this is 1. So this star rating that you were using for information about sellers, it turns out it contained no information at all. And the reason was, so the way this was computed, I think this was the fraction of positive feedback over the fraction of positive and negative feedback. And they found that the reason was that if you did leave someone negative feedback, there's a good chance you get threatened. So people would leave you nasty voicemail. They would threaten your safety. People were calling the police. And so if you didn't like your experience, you wouldn't leave negative feedback. You just wouldn't say anything. And so what they ended up doing was creating a metric where they said your rating is the ratio of positive feedback to everybody you've dealt with. And then the other piece, which I think is just really cool, is they realized that if they rolled it out to sellers, if they announced that this is what they were using, everyone would just game that, right? You just start getting voicemails that were like, you didn't leave me any feedback. Why didn't you leave me any feedback? Leave me feedback. So instead of rolling this out and announcing it, they just baked it into the search algorithm. So they started ranking search results using this, but they didn't tell anybody. And so they found this was much more truthful. If you look at the distribution, it's a nice, even distribution of feedback. They found it was correlated with quality. And so,
But eventually it was
yeah.
public.
But also, you can still leave negative feedback. So if you send someone threatening voicemail, it could get worse. So
It could get worse. So yeah, no, this is still there. So I think the assumption is that nobody's really going to leave negative feedback, and we're going to take this into account. And yeah, no, I think if eBay users start reading, econometrica papers, then we might have a problem. And so, what is the point of this? A lot of this, these are not talking about blockchain-based examples, but as we think about, what are a lot of the applications that people use to, hope to use blockchain for, a huge one is data marketplaces. We've worked with a lot of data marketplaces. Many of them think that there's no infrastructure required, right? We're going to launch the marketplace. People can come and buy and sell data, and we don't want to intermediate, right? And so thinking about what do we already know from eBay and other places, and how can we use them to maximize the probability that, UBDI, or this was IOTA's data marketplace. They have a really nice graphic. Does anybody know if they've launched? Last I heard they did. I just think it's really pretty.
What's there?
This is the IOTA data marketplace. Yeah.
I don't want to pause on the point that people were asking you. I mean, the joking aside about eBay users reading econometric papers, like if your mechanism is dependent on users' ignorance of how it works, like that doesn't seem sustainable. Like I don't know if people, this is in particular eBay, like you go to like a restaurant on OpenTable now and they like send 17,000 emails afterwards of like, please leave us a review.
Yeah.
Like they're not unaware of this kind of thing, and it's like incredibly annoying and somewhat dysfunctional. So like this, you're presenting this as like, oh, they solved this problem, and like, have they really?
I would say they've improved it. I would say they've added useful data to the marketplace, right? So the previous rating was useless. Now they have more information that they can use. How it evolves over time, I think, is an interesting question. I mean, it's related to the question of what happens when the parents in New York City figure out how to game the school match, right? But no, it's a good point. I don't know how email marketing works, though. So the final piece I wanted to talk about for, what do I have, 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Okay, is blockchain governance. And this is a piece that I think there's been more experimentation, so we have a little bit more data on this specifically in a blockchain setting. So what is governance? Just to start out, this is again the economics definition. Happy to talk with lawyers and others who think about this a lot. So we tend to think of governance as separate from operations. So operations is the rules and processes for the day-to-day. This is what's programmed into your protocol, more or less. Well-defined legal processes, things like this. Governance is the process by which you make decisions that are not part of the operations. Right, so we talked a little bit about the DAO hack earlier today. That's an example where governance was very useful. Another one that I actually like is when CryptoKitties launched and it completely clogged Ethereum. This was resolved in 2 ways. So first the miners got together and increased the network gas limit, but then they also they put a button that allowed you to resubmit your transactions with a higher gas price. And so this is an example where you might need governance in a positive situation too. It's not always that your platform's in a downward spiral.
Isn't this an example of let's wing it governance?
This is I think this is more like let's wing it governance, but it's a lot of examples you hear of governance tend to be like negative crises. And so I like this one because this is sort of adoption exceeded our greatest hopes. Now how do we expand quicker than we thought? So, yeah. So unfortunately, you can't eliminate the need for governance. There is an area of economics called the economics of incomplete contracts, which basically says that there's no way to write a contract that's going to perfectly anticipate everything that could possibly happen. There's always going to be a chance that either something's not specified or you need to renegotiate the contract, and therefore you're going to need governance. And so in a blockchain setting, when do you need governance? You need it either when the system is working, but we want to upgrade. Maybe we need to change the gas limit, or the system is in crisis, and we need to figure out what we're going to do. And this is also related to the talk earlier. One thing we talk about is there's really not an absence of governance, right? If there's a crisis, someone is going to step up and solve it. The question is it going to be the person who has the following or the, loudest screaming voice? Is it going to be the person or people that you've designated ahead of time because you want them to be making the decision? Right. So ignoring governance doesn't mean it goes away. It just means that you're, who knows? And one thing I did think was interesting was I hadn't thought before that might actually have some legal benefit. So I think that's an interesting point. So we think about the different elements. These are the economic elements of governance. And one thing that comes up a lot is thinking about who the stakeholders in the governance process should be. So after the need for governance was recognized, there was a movement towards what you could call referendum-based governance, which is every decision gets made by everybody. Maybe it's weighted by stake, but we're going to put every decision out to the community and have people vote. And it turns out when you do that, the participation in voting is extremely low, right? So this is a collection of data from Foreground Capital looking at participation in different on-chain governance votes. There's some higher participation here, but you get lots of participation below 10%. And so one question that we see platforms thinking about is the role of representative governance, right? How much decentralization do we need? What are the decisions that we know the entire community wants to be involved with, and which ones benefit from division of labor, right? We use division of labor in the governance of our countries, right? I mean, in California, we have referendum-based governance, which is interesting, but at least at the federal level, we have professional legislators, right? And this also allows for a degree of specialization. And so I think many projects we talk to are thinking about, what is the representative nature? What decisions do they make? What goes out to the full group? And how comfortable are we with introducing that additional layer of centralization? And so that's actually where I'm going to those are sort of the three areas I see for economic design that I anticipate we'll see a lot of progress over the next 12 months. One question that I want to leave open that I've found, there's a lot of, I've talked a lot about sort of how economics from other areas can be beneficial for blockchain. One thing I found really interesting to think about taking from blockchain and moving back into economics is thinking about the economic role of the firm. So economics has a concept of a firm. It has economic purposes. Depending on who you talk to, they're different. There's usually about 4. But if you think about how do we take a centralized system and get rid of the central authority, you find out that firms have a huge number of roles in our day-to-day activities. Their crisis decision-making, management by exception, they set up incentives. They do a whole variety of things that don't always get credit in the economic literature, but turns out are really important. And so going through and realizing sort of what are each of the different elements that we're used to having firms take care of, and can they be replicated in a more decentralized way is an interesting ongoing project. So anyway, that's the content I've got for you guys. Here's my contact information. I'm happy to take questions or comments or thoughts. Yep.
I just had a couple comments. First, you had this, your last question there was on the economic use of the firm, and I guess I just wanted to kind of give a slightly, another example that you might use to think about that is like, it seems to me like trying to imagine beforehand building Linux by a company would be really tough, actually. And it's kind of decentralized.
Yep.
So it's,
Unix existed beforehand, right? Like, you don't have to imagine all that hard.
Well, but I guess there's lots of...
Like, it was built at a company, like at AT&T.
It was built in the basement on two persons' own time because they want to play a video game. So I wouldn't say it was built by a company.
Android?
That's totally different.
Well, so I guess what I'm hearing is you're pushing back on the idea that there are open source projects that are
There may be a
decentralized.
different example that's a better one. I'm just saying that that particular example doesn't sort of like really uphold.
Okay, so there's lots of open source projects.
Sure.
Maybe you can pick your favorite one. I'm happy for you to pick your favorite open source project, and it seems like there are lots of economic things, benefit that's happening from those, and we might think about how they compare with decentralized. Maybe they're not. It's not easy to compare them to a firm. I had another comment. Earlier you were talking about, you said that these were on macro, you're coming from a micro perspective, and I guess you're talking about governance, and what was right at the end there. There's lots of things that seem to go beyond like the normal micro perspective, and it seems to me that, I don't know, I just wondered if you had a comment on like the impact of law and big things beyond micro. It seems like you were going beyond micro there.
So I think, yeah. So 2 things. I think the open source software example is very interesting. One thing I think that's interesting about Linux, I'm not an expert, is that Linux was invented, I guess, in a decentralized way. They had a very strong leader in Linus Torvalds. And then I think the example of Red Hat, the company, is very interesting because they tried to take Linux and turn it into something that was eventually purchased by IBM. So it's sort of the reverse. But I agree with you that those examples are interesting. In terms of the macro versus microeconomics, and that was more a comment. If you go and study traditional macroeconomics, like you'd go work in monetary policy at the Fed, it's traditionally not based on models of individual agent choice. It's the kind of thing where you're like, GDP is equal to I haven't done this in so long, but like consumption plus investment plus, net exports or something like that. So there's, that comment was just to separate those, that we're not thinking about 70s monetary policy, which is an area of economics that is economics. And I completely agree about law. I'm not a lawyer. I think this is basically just presenting, what we see from the economist's point of view. Yeah.
I have a specific question. Your opinion about Algorand's mechanism, which basically allowed the original set of people who bought from their ICO to get 90% back if the value fell below $1 or something like that. Are you familiar with that mechanism? And
Somewhat, yeah.
do you have any thoughts about how it worked and whether it was successful or?
I'd have to look at it more deeply. Yeah. Comments, questions, thoughts? All right, thank you.